The worst part about being erased in your own family is that everyone else still smiles while it happens. I remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting the simple navy dress I had chosen for my sister's engagement party, trying to convince myself that today would be normal. My name is Claire Mitchell, and for most of my life I had already learned how to take up less space than I needed to. The invitation had come weeks earlier, printed in elegant gold lettering, announcing the engagement of my younger sister, Melissa, to a man my father proudly described as a rising star with a strong future. There was no mention of me in the special acknowledgments, but I still expected to attend as family. That was my mistake. The mansion my father rented for the engagement was everything people imagine when they think of old money and social status in California. The marble steps led to tall glass doors that opened into a ballroom filled with soft golden lighting, floral arrangements that must have cost more than my monthly salary, and guests dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns that carried quiet confidence. He arrived a few minutes early, hoping to slip in quietly before attention gathered. My father was already inside, standing near the center of the room with a glass of champagne in his hand, greeting guests with the kind of smile he reserved for important occasions. When his eyes landed on me, there was a brief pause that felt longer than it should have been. He lifted my hand slightly in greeting, expecting at least a nod. Instead, he turned back toward the guests around him as if I had simply been part of the background. He told myself not to overthink it. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he had not seen me properly. But something about the way his posture shifted made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. Melissa was glowing across the room, surrounded by friends who were laughing and taking pictures. She looked every bit the center of attention, her engagement ring catching the light every time she moved her hand. When she finally spotted me, she smiled brightly and waved me over, but before I could take a step forward, my father raised his voice slightly to address a group of guests nearby. "My daughter," he said with a light laugh, gesturing casually in my direction without even looking at me fully. "No, just my guest tonight." The words landed in the air like something sharp had been dropped into a perfectly polished room. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether it was a joke or not. My heart slowed in a way that felt almost unreal as I looked around, waiting for someone, anyone, to correct him. No one did. Melissa's smile faltered slightly, but she said nothing. My father took another sip of his drink as if nothing unusual had happened. He stood still near the edge of the ballroom, feeling the temperature of the room shift around me in ways I could not ignore. Conversations continued, but I noticed subtle glances now directed toward me, quiet assessments forming in the spaces between polite smiles. He had come expecting to be part of a family celebration, yet suddenly I felt like an outsider observing a life I was no longer included in. The marble floor beneath my heels suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if I had stepped into the wrong place without realizing it. He glanced toward the entrance doors, wondering how many steps it would take to leave without anyone noticing. Before I could decide, a new presence entered the room, changing the atmosphere in a way I did not immediately understand. The conversation softened, posture straightened, and attention subtly shifted toward the front entrance. A tall man in a dark tailored suit walked in with calm precision, scanning the room with controlled awareness rather than curiosity. There was something about the way he moved that made people instinctively give him space without being asked. Melissa's expression brightened instantly when she saw him. "Is here," she whispered excitedly, moving toward him with a confidence that returned all the attention in the room to her side of the family. He had no idea yet that this man, her fiancé, a decorated Navy SEAL according to the introduction I overheard, was about to become the one person in that entire room who would actually see what was happening, when no one else would. The moment the man Melissa ran toward stepped fully into the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was almost physical. Conversations that had been flowing casually seconds before now softened into careful murmurs, as if the room itself had collectively decided to pay attention. He moved with controlled ease, the kind of presence that did not demand recognition but naturally received it anyway. His eyes scanned the space once, briefly, and then settled on Melissa with immediate focus. She reached him with a bright smile, and for a moment the world seemed to center around their reunion. He remained near the edge of the room, still processing what my father had said aloud only minutes earlier. "Just a guest." The phrase repeated itself in my mind in a rhythm I could not stop. He tried to convince myself it had been a misunderstanding, a poorly timed joke, something meant to lighten the mood in front of wealthy guests my father wanted to impress. But no one had laughed in a way that confirmed it was humor. No one had corrected him either. That silence felt heavier than the words themselves. As Melissa introduced her fiancé around the room, I observed him from a distance. There was something steady about him, not loud or performative, but observant. He shook hands with guests politely, but his attention kept returning to details rather than noise. The way he noticed posture changes. The way he acknowledged pauses in conversation. The way he briefly studied my father before exchanging a few quiet words with him. He did not think much of it at first, assuming it was simple courtesy between future in-laws. My father, however, seemed more animated than usual in his presence. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his tone, and spoke with a level of attentiveness he had not shown toward me all evening. He watched this shift carefully, trying not to let it affect me more than it already had. The engagement party continued around us, glasses clinking softly, laughter rising and falling in carefully curated waves. A string quartet played near the far end of the room, adding elegance that felt distant from where I stood. He moved slightly toward a table near the wall, taking a glass of sparkling water from a passing server without making eye contact with anyone. It felt easier to become invisible than to remain visible under unfamiliar definitions of belonging. Melissa eventually crossed the room again, her hand gently resting on her fiancé's arm as she guided him toward my father. He noticed how quickly the energy between the three of them aligned, as though they were forming a circle I had already been excluded from. My father smiled more broadly now, speaking in a tone that suggested approval and pride. He gestured lightly as he spoke, occasionally glancing toward the fiancé as if seeking confirmation or agreement. He could not hear their words clearly, but I saw enough to understand that I was no longer part of the conversation. The fiancé, however, did something unexpected. While my father spoke, he briefly shifted his gaze past him, scanning the room again. His eyes landed on me for the first time. It was not a passing glance. It was direct, steady, and observant in a way that made me instinctively still. There was no expression of judgment, curiosity, or indifference. Only attention. He looked away almost immediately, uncomfortable with being seen so clearly in a space where I had already been dismissed. But something about that brief moment lingered. Minutes passed. I remained at the edge of the room, listening to fragments of conversations and watching patterns of interaction that now felt different than when I first arrived. The realization was slow but unavoidable. He was not being ignored accidentally. He was being positioned intentionally outside the structure of the evening. Not as a daughter. Not as family. But as something less defined. I guessed. The word no longer felt like a misunderstanding. It felt like a label everyone had silently agreed to accept. Across the room, my father raised his glass again during a toast preparing to honor Melissa and her fiancé. The guests turned toward him expectantly, and I felt a subtle tightening in my chest as I prepared to hear what role, if any, I would be assigned in his words this time. What I did not yet realize was that the man standing beside my sister was not only observing the celebration, but quietly evaluating something far deeper than appearances. And in a matter of moments, his attention would shift from polite observation to recognition that would change everything I thought I understood about that night. The moment my father stepped forward to begin his toast, the entire ballroom fell into a polished silence. Crystal glasses paused midair, conversations faded into expectation, and every guest turned toward him as though the evening itself was waiting for permission to continue. It stood beneath the warm chandelier light with a calm smile that felt practiced, the kind of expression used when presenting something carefully curated to an audience that mattered. I remained at the edge of the room, still holding my glass of sparkling water, already bracing myself for whatever words would follow my earlier humiliation. My sister stood close to her fiancé, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression glowing with anticipation. The Navy SEAL beside her remained composed, but his attention was not entirely on my father. He noticed that immediately. His eyes moved across the room again, slow and deliberate, as though he was mapping relationships rather than admiring decorations. Then, without warning, his gaze stopped. It did not land on my father. It landed on me. For the second time that evening, I felt the weight of being seen in a room where I had already been dismissed. But this time, his expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from others, but subtly enough that it felt intentional. His posture shifted slightly, and his focus narrowed, as if something in his memory had been triggered. My father began speaking, his voice carrying easily across the room. He welcomed guests, thanked them for attending, and praised the union between my sister and her fiancé. Each sentence was met with polite approval from the crowd. I noticed how carefully he structured his words, emphasizing status, success, and family reputation. There was no mention of me. Not even indirectly. As the toast continued, I found myself studying the Navy SEAL more closely. It was no longer simply observing. It was comparing. His attention flicked between my father and me in a pattern that felt increasingly deliberate. At one point, his eyes lingered on my face long enough that I instinctively looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity of being analyzed in such a quiet, controlled way. When I glanced back, I saw him leaning slightly toward Melissa and asking her something in a low voice. She responded quickly, almost casually, but I noticed a brief hesitation in her expression afterward. That was the first crack in the carefully maintained atmosphere of the evening. My father raised his glass higher, concluding his toast with a final statement about unity, bride, and family legacy. The guests responded with applause that felt rehearsed, a sound that filled the room but did not carry warmth. He remained still, unsure whether I was expected to join in or simply disappear further into the background. As the applause faded, the Navy SEAL stepped forward slightly, just enough to signal that he intended to speak next. The room's attention shifted toward him immediately. There was something about his presence that made silence feel more structured, less accidental. He accepted a glass from a passing server but did not drink from it. Instead, he turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room once more before settling in a direction that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. He was looking directly at me again. This time, however, there was no confusion in his expression. Only recognition forming with increasing clarity. My father noticed the shift in attention and followed his gaze. For a brief moment, the three of us were aligned in a line of sight that no one else in the room seemed aware of. I felt something shift in the atmosphere that I could not name yet. The Navy SEAL lowered his glass slightly, his voice calm but firm enough to cut through the remaining noise of the room. He asked a simple question, directed not at the crowd, not at my father, but at me. Have we met before? The question was quiet, but it landed with more weight than anything said that entire evening. My father's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. My sister looked between us, suddenly, unsure of what she was witnessing. And in that moment, I realized that whatever this man had seen in me was not accidental. It was recognition. And recognition meant there was something about my presence here that no one else in the room understood yet, not even my father, who suddenly no longer looked entirely certain that the story he had told everyone tonight was complete. For a brief moment after the Navy SEAL asked his question, the entire ballroom seemed to lose its rhythm. Conversations did not continue, music did not matter, and even the soft clinking of glasses faded into a suspended silence that felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier in the evening. He stood still near the edge of the room, my glass lowered slightly in my hand, unsure whether I was supposed to answer or simply disappear further into the background as I had been doing all night. My father's expression tightened almost instantly. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of reaction that happens when someone realizes a conversation has moved into territory they did not intend to enter. Melissa turned her head toward her fiancé, her brows drawing together in confusion, sensing that something had shifted but not yet understanding what it was. The Navy SEAL did not move from his position. His attention remained fixed on me, calm and steady, as though he had already made a conclusion and was only waiting for confirmation. "Have we met before?" he repeated, this time more clearly, though still without raising his voice. My mind searched quickly through every recent memory, every social gathering, every professional interaction I could recall, but there was nothing that connected me to him. He shook my head slightly, signaling no. My response should have ended the moment. Instead, it only seemed to deepen his focus. He studied me for another long moment, his expression controlled but no longer neutral. There was something familiar in his gaze now, not recognition of a past meeting, but recognition of something else entirely. Something placed rather than remembered. My father stepped forward slightly, inserting himself into the space between us with a polite but firm tone. "I am sure there is some misunderstanding," he said quickly, attempting to guide the moment back into the structure of the evening. "My daughter does not have any association with military circles or," he paused briefly, choosing his words carefully, "anything relevant to your background." The phrasing landed awkwardly, drawing attention without intending to. A few nearby guests exchanged subtle glances, sensing the shift in tone. The Navy SEAL finally turned his head toward my father, acknowledging him directly for the first time since speaking to me. "See," he said calmly, "I am not asking about association." The way he said it was neither confrontational nor polite. It was factual. Mature. Certain. That distinction changed the atmosphere again. My father straightened slightly, his confidence faltering just enough for those closest to notice. Melissa looked between them, her earlier excitement now replaced with uncertainty. He remained where I was, feeling the attention of the entire room settle into a new focal point that I did not choose but was now central to. The Navy SEAL took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation feel private despite the surrounding audience. His eyes returned to me. "I have seen that necklace before," he said. The words were simple, but they struck the room differently than anything said before. My hand instinctively moved to my chest, where the silver pendant rested beneath the fabric of my dress. My father's posture stiffened immediately. He noticed it even before he spoke. "That is not possible," he said quickly, his tone sharper now, losing the earlier composure. But the Navy SEAL did not look away. Instead, he continued speaking in the same steady voice. "It is possible," he replied. "And I know exactly where." The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer confusion or social discomfort. It was recognition beginning to form in places where people had not expected it. He felt my breath slow as I looked between them, realizing that this evening had shifted into something none of us were fully prepared for. My father had brought me here to be seen as a guest. But for the first time since arriving, I understood that someone in this room was seeing me as something entirely different, and that recognition was about to challenge every version of the story I had been told about my place in this family. The moment the Navy SEAL said he knew exactly where the necklace had been seen before, the entire ballroom seemed to tighten again, as if the air itself had become more concentrated. Conversations did not resume. No one moved away. Instead, guests subtly leaned in, sensing that whatever was unfolding was no longer just an awkward family moment but something far more significant. My father let out a short, controlled laugh that did not match his expression. "This is ridiculous," he said, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "That necklace has been in our family for decades. It turned slightly toward me as if reinforcing his statement, but I noticed his eyes did not fully meet mine. The Navy SEAL remained calm, unaffected by the shift in tone. It took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough to command attention without appearing aggressive. "See," he said again, addressing my father directly, "I am not disputing ownership. I am identifying origin." That distinction landed heavily in the silence. Melissa looked increasingly uncertain, her earlier excitement replaced by confusion as she glanced between her fiancé, my father, and me. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, not from fear, but from the strange sense that I was standing at the center of something I had never been informed about. My father adjusted his stance, placing his glass carefully on a nearby table as if preparing for control rather than conversation. "You are mistaken," he insisted. "That necklace belonged to my late wife. It was passed down through her family and given to my daughter." The word daughter carried emphasis, almost defensive, as if repetition alone could strengthen its meaning. The Navy SEAL did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied me again, this time with more focus, as though connecting pieces that had been separated for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "I have seen that exact design in a restricted case file during my last assignment overseas," he said. "Not as jewelry. As identification." A ripple of confusion moved through nearby guests. Some exchanged glances, others remained still, unsure whether they had heard correctly. My father's face changed subtly, tension replacing composure in a way I had never seen before. "That is impossible," he said immediately. But this time, his response came faster than thought, not slower. The Navy SEAL turned slightly toward Melissa, then back to me. "May I ask a direct question?" he said. No one objected. The room had already surrendered its control of the situation. It pointed gently, not at me, but at the necklace resting beneath my dress. "Where did she actually get it?" The question was simple, but it removed all performance from the moment. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since the evening began, he did not have an immediate answer ready. He felt every gaze in the room shift toward him, waiting. Waiting not for explanation, but for confirmation. Melissa stepped slightly closer to her fiancé, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean identification?" she asked, though it sounded like she already regretted asking it. The Navy SEAL did not take his eyes off my father as he answered. "It is linked to a family record that was classified for protection, not display," he said. "And the last documented transfer of it was never recorded in any public estate." Silence fell again, deeper this time. My father's expression hardened, but beneath it I saw something else beginning to surface. Uncertainty. Not about me, but about the version of truth he had been maintaining for years. He instinctively touched the necklace again, feeling its weight differently now. It was no longer just something I had inherited. It was something that had history beyond what I had been told. The Navy SEAL finally looked directly at me again. His voice softened slightly, but his certainty did not fade. "I believe," he said carefully, "that you are not where you were told you came from." The words did not feel like an accusation. They felt like the beginning of a correction. And for the first time that night, I saw my father's composure break just enough to reveal that he understood exactly what that correction might mean. The silence that followed the Navy SEAL's last statement did not feel temporary anymore. It felt structural, as if the entire ballroom had shifted into a different version of itself where nothing could return to how it was before. My father stood motionless for several seconds, his expression caught between denial and recognition, as though both were competing for control of his response. Around Boise, guests no longer pretended to be uninterested. Every glance, every subtle turn of the head, every paused conversation now pointed toward the center of the room where I stood holding the necklace that had suddenly become the focus of everything. Melissa looked unsettled, Her earlier joy completely replaced by confusion she did not know how to interpret. She reached lightly for her fiancé's arm, but he did not respond to her immediately. His attention remained locked on my father, not with hostility, but with a level of analytical calm that made the room feel even more controlled. My father finally exhaled, the sound measured but strained. "This is being misunderstood," he said, though his voice lacked the authority it had carried earlier in the evening. "There is no hidden meaning here. That necklace is a family heirloom, nothing more." But even as he spoke, I could hear the effort behind the words. The certainty that had carried him through the earlier humiliation had begun to fracture. The Navy SEAL did not interrupt. Instead, he took another step forward, positioning himself so that he was no longer addressing only my father but the entire room. His posture remained calm, almost respectful, but his presence now carried undeniable authority. "I am not making assumptions," he said clearly. "I am referencing documented identification protocols that match that exact pendant design." A faint murmur moved through the guests, quickly suppressed by their own uncertainty. No one wanted to misinterpret what they were witnessing, but no one could ignore it either. He felt my fingers tighten slightly around the necklace beneath my dress, as if it had suddenly become heavier than before. My father turned his head slightly, as though searching for support from someone in the room, but found none. The Navy SEAL continued, his voice steady. "There are systems in place that record lineage markers tied to specific items. That necklace is not decorative. It is functional." The word functional changed the atmosphere again. It stripped away the possibility of this being a family misunderstanding and introduced something far more serious. Melissa stepped back slightly, her expression now fully unsettled. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. The Navy SEAL finally looked at her briefly before returning his focus to my father. "I am saying that the explanation given here does not align with known records," he replied. My father's jaw tightened. For the first time, I saw frustration break through his carefully maintained composure. "You have no right to interrogate my family," he said sharply. The word family came out with force, but it no longer carried confidence. It carried defense. The Navy SEAL did not react to the shift in tone. Instead, he lowered his voice slightly. "I am not interrogating anyone," he said. "I am confirming what already exists in a secured archive that I have personally accessed." That statement changed everything. The room fell into a deeper silence, one that felt less social and more investigative. He noticed several guests subtly stepping back, as if distance could protect them from being involved in whatever was unfolding. My father looked at me then, really looked at me, not as a guest, not as a presence in the room, but as something tied directly to the problem he was now facing. For the first time since the evening began, his expression toward me was no longer dismissive. It was uncertain. Almost afraid. The Navy SEAL followed his gaze. "If I am correct," he said carefully, "then she is not connected to this story the way she has been told." My breath slowed as the weight of that statement settled over me. He had entered this room as someone dismissed in front of strangers. Now I stood at the center of a revelation I had not asked for, holding on to a single piece of jewelry that was no longer just a memory of my mother, but a question no one in this room seemed prepared to fully answer. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a room suspended in a moment that no one had permission to resolve. Every guest remained frozen in place, their attention locked on the exchange unfolding between my father and the Navy SEAL, as if any movement might disturb something irreversible. He could feel my own heartbeat in a way I had not noticed earlier, steady but heavier, as though my body was reacting to a truth my mind had not fully accepted yet. My father finally broke the silence, but not with certainty. His voice came lower, more controlled, as if he was trying to regain authority through tone alone. "You are making claims based on classified interpretations of something you clearly do not understand in its full context," he said. The words were structured, careful, but lacked conviction. The Navy SEAL did not react immediately. Instead, he observed my father for a long moment, not in challenge, but in assessment. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm. "I am not interpreting anything," he replied. "I am recognizing a verified pattern that appears across multiple restricted records tied to that exact item." The word pattern made the air feel different. It suggested repetition, history, and something far larger than a single family explanation. My sister stepped slightly closer to the center of the room, her face pale now, her earlier excitement completely gone. "This is getting out of hand," she said quietly, though her voice lacked any real authority. No one responded to her. The guests remained silent, not because they were told to be, but because they did not know what category of conversation they were witnessing anymore. I stood still, my fingers still resting near the necklace beneath my dress. It no longer felt like jewelry. It felt like evidence of something I had never been allowed to understand. The Navy SEAL turned his attention back to me again, and this time his expression softened slightly, not in emotion, but in recognition of uncertainty I was still carrying. "May I ask?" "Do something directly," he said. I hesitated, then nodded. It took a slow breath before continuing. "Has anyone ever explained to you why that necklace contains structural markings that are used in identification protocols outside of civilian systems?" The question was precise, almost clinical. I shook my head immediately. "No," I answered. My voice sounded smaller than I expected in the large room. My father's expression changed at that response. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. A brief tightening around the eyes, a shift in posture, as if the simplicity of my answer created a problem he had not anticipated being stated aloud. The Navy SEAL nodded once, as if confirming something internally. "Then there is a gap in transmission," he said quietly. My father immediately responded. "There is no gap," he insisted. "There is only a family history that does not require external interpretation." But even as he said it, the certainty in his voice had weakened further. The Navy SEAL did not argue. Instead, he stepped slightly to the side, allowing the conversation to widen rather than intensify. "I am not here to challenge your version of events," he said. "I am here because I have seen this pattern before in contexts where identity records were intentionally separated from personal documentation." The phrase "intentionally separated" shifted the atmosphere again. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Melissa looked between all three of us now, her confusion deepening into concern. I felt something inside me tighten, not fear exactly, but a growing awareness that the story I had believed about myself was no longer fully intact. My father turned toward me again, and for the first time that night, there was no performance in his expression. Only something closer to urgency. "Clyde," he said, using my name directly in a way he had not done since the beginning of the evening, "you need to understand that what he is suggesting is not accurate to your life or your history." The Navy SEAL immediately responded, not raising his voice, but matching the seriousness of the moment. "I am suggesting nothing," he said. "I am identifying what exists." The difference between suggestion and identification settled over the room like a weight. I looked at both of them, feeling the full instability of everything I had been told. My identity, my family role, even the meaning of the necklace I had worn for years now seemed to exist in a space between two conflicting truths, neither of which had been fully explained to me. And for the first time since stepping into that ballroom, I realized that the real question was no longer whether I belonged there as a daughter or a guest. The question was whether the version of my life I had always believed was complete was missing something fundamental that no one had ever prepared me to hear. The silence that followed felt different from all the moments before it. It was no longer the silence of confusion or shock. It had become the silence of attention turning into understanding, as if every person in the ballroom was beginning to realize that what they were witnessing had moved beyond a private family dispute and into something far more significant. My father stood still for several seconds, his eyes no longer fixed on the Navy SEAL, but on me. For the first time since the evening began, I saw something in his expression that was not control or performance. It was uncertainty shaped by fear of being misunderstood in a way he could not correct easily. "This conversation is over," he said finally, though his voice lacked the strength it needed to close anything. The Navy SEAL did not move or react immediately. Instead, he simply observed the room again, taking in the reactions of guests, the subtle shifts in posture, the way people were no longer pretending not to listen. "It is not over," he said calmly. "It is only now becoming accurate." That statement changed the energy again. Not louder, not more dramatic, but deeper, as if something structural had shifted beneath the surface of the evening. He felt my hand instinctively tighten near the necklace again, but this time I did not pull away from the feeling. He needed to understand why it had become the center of everything without me ever being told its importance. My father took a step closer to me, lowering his voice so only I could. "Here. You do not need to engage with this," he said quietly. "This is not about you." But even as he said it, I could hear the contradiction forming in his own words. The Navy SEAL turned his attention toward me once more, but this time there was no interrogation in his expression. Only clarity. "It is about her," he said simply. My father immediately responded. "No, it is not." But his response came too quickly, too firmly, as if the speed itself revealed something beneath it. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. The atmosphere had reached a point where every denial created more weight rather than removing it. The Navy SEAL paused for a moment before speaking again. "There are systems," he said carefully, "that do not rely on family explanation or personal narrative. They rely on physical markers. That necklace matches one of those markers." The words were precise, deliberate, and unavoidable. I looked at him, searching for exaggeration, misunderstanding, anything that would make this feel less real. But his expression did not offer uncertainty. Only measured certainty. My father exhaled sharply, turning slightly away as if the room itself had become too difficult to face directly. "You are projecting meaning onto something that is purely sentimental," he said, though his voice no longer carried conviction. The Navy SEAL shook his head slightly. "I am not projecting," he replied. "I am recognizing classification." That word landed heavily again. Classification. It did not belong in a ballroom. It did not belong in a family engagement. It belonged somewhere far removed from celebration or social gathering. Melissa finally stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "What does that even mean?" she asked. No one answered her immediately. The Navy SEAL turned slightly, acknowledging her question without directly shifting focus away from me. "It means," he said carefully, "that what she has been told about her identity may not be complete." The room reacted without sound. It was not a gasp or a murmur. It was a collective stillness that suggested everyone understood they had crossed into a moment that could not be reversed. My father looked at me again, and this time there was no attempt to control the narrative. Only urgency mixed with something closer to concern. "Claire," he said, his voice quieter now, "do not let this confuse you." But I was no longer confused in the same way. Confusion implies missing information. What I felt now was the beginning of awareness that information had been intentionally separated from me. He looked down at the necklace again, feeling its weight differently than I ever had before. It was no longer just something inherited. It was something referenced. Something recognized. Something that existed outside the story I had been told. The Navy SEAL spoke one final time, his voice steady but no longer directed at my father. It was directed at me. "If I am correct," he said, "then the truth of where you come from is not fully reflected in what you have been told." And in that moment, with every person in the room watching, I understood that the word guest was no longer the most important label I had been given that night. It was only the beginning of a much larger question I had never been allowed to ask. The ballroom no longer felt like a place where a celebration was happening. It felt like a room where something irreversible had already been said, and everyone present was simply waiting for the final shape of it to become clear. He stood in the same position near the edge of the room, but I no longer felt like I was on the outside of an event. He felt like I was standing at the center of a shift that had been building long before I ever walked in. My father looked around the room slowly, as if searching for a way to regain control of something that was no longer responding to him. But there was nothing left to control. The Navy SEAL remained still, his posture calm, his attention steady, as if he had already reached the end of an analysis and was now waiting for acknowledgement rather than resistance. Melissa stood frozen beside him, her hand no longer resting comfortably on his arm, her expression caught between confusion and disbelief. "This is absurd," my father said finally, but the words did not carry the authority he intended. They sounded defensive now, not commanding. "The Navy." Seal responded without raising his voice. "It is not absurd," he said. "It is consistent." That single word created another silence, heavier than the ones before it. Consistent implied structure. Pattern. Something that had existed long enough to be recognized. He looked at my father then, truly looked at him, and noticed something I had not allowed myself to see earlier. It was not simply trying to dismiss what was being said. It was trying to protect something that was no longer fully under his control. "You are turning a family moment into something it is not," he continued, but even as he spoke, his tone faltered slightly. The Navy SEAL shook his head once. "I am not turning anything into anything," he replied calmly. "I am identifying what already exists beneath the version of events being presented here." My father stepped forward again, but this time his movement felt less certain. "You are speaking as if you have authority over my daughter's identity," he said. The emphasis on the word daughter carried tension rather than confidence. The Navy SEAL finally shifted his gaze fully toward him. "I am speaking as someone who has seen this exact marker associated with individuals whose records were intentionally separated from standard documentation systems," he said. The phrase "intentionally separated" made the room feel colder, even without any change in temperature. He felt a subtle tightening in my chest as I listened, not because I understood everything, but because I was beginning to understand enough to realize that the story I had lived inside might have been incomplete in ways I had never imagined. My father's voice rose slightly. "That does not apply here," he said quickly. "You are making assumptions based on incomplete information." The Navy SEAL paused, then responded in a quieter tone. "Then provide the complete information." That request shifted the entire dynamic again. It was no longer accusation. It was invitation. And in that invitation, I saw hesitation for the first time in my father's expression. Not anger. Not denial. Hesitation. The kind that appears when someone realizes they are no longer the only person holding the narrative together. Melissa looked between them, her voice barely steady. "What are you both talking about?" she asked. But no one answered her immediately. My attention drifted back to the necklace beneath my dress. It felt different now, not physically, but in meaning. It was no longer just something passed down or preserved. It was something that had been referenced, identified, and recognized by someone outside of my family without hesitation. He finally spoke, though my voice felt quieter than I intended. "What exactly is it supposed to mean?" The Navy SEAL looked at me directly when I asked the question, and his expression softened slightly, not in emotion, but in precision. "It means," he said carefully, "that your identity may have been recorded in more than one context." My father immediately responded. "That is not true," he said, but the speed of his answer again revealed more than it concealed. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was waiting. waiting for a truth that had already begun to surface but had not yet been fully spoken aloud. And in that silence, I realized that the most important question was no longer about the necklace. It was about everything I thought I already knew about who I was, and why no one in my own family had ever told me the full version of it.